Okay, it's a great pleasure to introduce Kyle Harper for our annual Centre for Ancient Environmental Studies lecture. Kyle is GT and Libby Blankenship Chair in the History of Liberty and Professor of Classics and Letters at the University of Oklahoma. Been practicing that. It's very hard to sum up the incredible range and creativity of Kyle's work in just a few minutes. He's published on a huge range of topics. His first book was Slavery in the Late Roman World, published in 2011, followed in 2013 by From Shame to Sin, the Christian Transformation of Sexual Morality. In 2017, he published The Fate of Rome, Climate, Disease, and the End of an Empire. And then his fourth book in 2021, Plagues Upon the Earth, Disease and the Cause of Human History. Kyle has made and is making a major contribution to the enterprise of integrating the natural sciences into the study of human history. Those last two books in particular have made a huge difference in opening up new questions, new challenges in ancient environmental studies. It would be hard to overstate the influence they have had. And that makes Kyle an ideal speaker for this annual lecture. So one of our goals in founding the Centre for Ancient Environmental Studies a couple of years ago was to bring together a range of different approaches to study of human-environment relations in antiquity and ancient environments, covering scientific, archaeological, historical, literary approaches, and so on. And with that goal in mind, we've had 7 other wonderful papers today as part of our workshop on new approaches to plague in the history of plague in late antiquity. This is actually Kyle's second paper of the day. He presented earlier today together with his Oklahoma colleague Scott Johnson on representations of plague in the late antique Syriac writer John of Ephesus. We're really delighted to have Scott with us today as well. So yeah,
Just looking at the camera.
Is that all okay?
Yeah.
So yeah, we have a large online audience here today, in addition to the 50 or more who are here in person. Yeah, for those of you who are listening online, I hope everything's okay. We'll tweak the IT over the next few minutes. If not, please feed through on the chat. And I hope that those of you who are listening online will feel able to be involved in discussion afterwards. Most simply, I think, by typing questions into the chat. But I'll come back to that after Kyle's lecture. So the last thing to say is that after Kyle's lecture, we have a drinks reception in Swallowgate 3, which is on the ground floor of the School of Classics building. Out of the quad, turn right, and just follow the crowd. Please do come along. Everybody's very welcome to that. I hope you can hang around and chat afterwards. So at this point, I'm going to pass over to Kyle for his lecture on the long first plague pandemic, a view from Italy.
Thank you. Thank you, Jason. Thank you all very much. What an amazing day. I'm very grateful to the Center for inviting me and putting together such a wonderful workshop, and to the fellow presenters for teaching me so much. I think today has been a really amazing testament to what an exciting field ancient environmental history is, and particularly the study of health and disease. I don't think it could have been any more stimulating or reflective of the a really dramatic scene, the last 3 chapters of the plague in Milan. And Manzoni writes about how plague invaded and ravaged a great part of Italy, how the immense ditches that were dug were filled with corpses, how the heaps of dead bodies lying before the eyes of the living made the city a vast tomb, how the death-like silence reigned around when Renzo walks out to his village. Here you see a woodcut made by a contemporary. It's, of course, surely somewhat stylized, but showing from someone who lived through it, a representation of the chaos of living through the plague of Milan. You can see about 8 carts full of dead bodies. You see a priest and people kneeling at prayer or a mass. And you can see a soldier, I think, chasing a dog who's probably doing things he shouldn't with the corpses. So this is a dramatic account of this plague. And what's striking about it is that we know where Manzoni got it. He's reliant virtually entirely on a roughly contemporary source by a churchman who was also a local historian, Giuseppe Ripamonte, who wrote an account of the outbreak in Milan. What's amazing and enviable from a late antique historian's point of view is how much we really know about this outbreak. There's more knowledge, at least more documentation, of the single outbreak than there is of the entire first pandemic. And it's an opportunity, of course, to compare from a context where we do have really strong documentary evidence. And in this case, Guido Alfani, an economic historian, has done amazing work from parish registers as well as documents like the accounts of the dead in Milan to trace the patterns of this particular outbreak, which was not universal across northern Italy, but which was widespread and pervasive and had a massive demographic impact in Milan, where nearly half the population was lost in this one single event, as well as across many of the villages and towns of northern Italy. It's a very different world where the documentary base is much richer because of civic documents as well as ecclesiastical documents like parish registrations. But I think this moment in the history of the second pandemic is at least food for thought. It's a way to start by reminding us that the whole pandemic in the chronological breadth of the sense of a pandemic is important. This comes towards the end of the second pandemic, the 17th century in Europe and the Mediterranean, but it reminds us that the pandemic as a whole isn't simply the first outbreak, the Black Death of the 14th century or the plague of Justinian in ours. I think it also opens up avenues for comparative history. I'm interested in the plague in late antique Italy, and for both the search of comparison and contrast, we can learn a lot from comparison with the example of the second pandemic. So very much, if you were here throughout the day, as Peter Saris had to say in his opening thought. It also reminds us that the sources of sources matter. Manzoni is 2 centuries removed from the events he's describing, but in fact, he had a very good contemporary source that's the basis for his fictionalized, but nonetheless, in many ways, realistic depiction of the events, because the sources that he used were close to the events in question. It also reminds us, the history of the second pandemic in this larger sense, that the plague, Yersinia pestis, the specific disease caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, really stands out. Even in the 17th century, when there's absolutely variola, smallpox, when there's typhus, which is a terrible disease, swirling together, Yersinia pestis is unambiguously responsible for the most severe mortality events in these very well-documented cases. This is as true of Italy as it is of England. So Yersinia pestis really is a disease in a league of its own. Have I lost my control? And Manzoni's elaborate rhetoric reminds us that sometimes rhetoric is true. We can't take it at face value. We look at it critically and analytically, but we don't reject it out of hand simply because it is flamboyant or extremely emotive. The plague often, in fact, evoked intense emotions because it was traumatic. So with that, it's worth returning to the plague of Justinian and the first pandemic. This is an argument I will never win, but I really think we ought to call the outbreak in the 540s the plague of Justinian, and we ought to call the first pandemic the whole series of outbreaks that lasts for over 2 centuries, why we call an outbreak of plague in the Abbasid Caliphate part of the plague of Justinian. I don't know. This is so objectively a good argument, but I struggle to convince people. But I will always say the plague of Justinian to mean the outbreak in the 540s, and the first pandemic to mean the entire series of plague outbreaks that last over 2 centuries across much of Western Eurasia and Africa. It's a history whose details are increasingly being filled in, not least by the contribution of archaeogenetics, the archaeogenetics of rodent populations, as we saw today from David, the archaeogenetics of bacteria, as we saw today from Gunnar, as well as hopefully and increasingly the genetics of human population history. But I think if we've seen one thing today, it's that there's still a tremendous amount to be learned about this pandemic. Some of the most important sources have never even been critically studied, and there's also an important place for traditional historical analysis and philological analysis. In fact, the advent of radically new kinds of scientific evidence from archaeogenetics and other fields really only intensifies and enriches the possibility of reading the historical sources that in many cases we've known for a very long time in light of or against the grain of this new kind of evidence. So they're mutually illuminating and challenging in ways that I think can be very productive, particularly if we think about the shape of the first pandemic as a whole, as I will today. We have a remarkable lack of written sources for the first pandemic compared to the second pandemic as a whole. And so I think it behooves us to pay close attention, critical attention, to really every single last drop of evidence that we have about the human experience and human witness and human perception of this pandemic event. The pandemic is something we're learning a lot about. There have always been a range of views, including highly skeptical views, as Peter summarized today, about the significance, demographic significance, and then, of course, downstream social, economic, and political implications. There are extremely minimalizing views that think the plague of Justinian and subsequent outbreaks are simply not important, even in a demographic sense, that they're best compared to our seasonal flu. Even among the majority of historians who've looked at this, who think that it is consequential, there's a range of perspectives and emphases. Misha Myers emphasized its tremendous cultural importance above all. Peter Saris has emphasized its social, legal, and economic consequences and is increasingly encouraging us to think about its global repercussions. For decades, Mike McCormick has helped expand our knowledge of it, emphasizing its demographic and ecological dimensions. And I would try and emphasize the interplay between human and environmental systems, of which the plague is simply a major, major ingredient. Archaeogenetics is one of the domains that's really pushing forward what we can know and what we can ask about this pandemic. Of course, the landmark publication of Peller, Speyru, and others in 2019 that documented the presence of Yersinia pestis from a range of sites throughout Western Europe. We saw this morning that Gunnar is adding more and more sites to this map, but it's already really stimulated remarkable advances in knowledge as well as new questions. Not just confirming the pathogen, which was doubted right down until the complete confirmation of the pathogen, which really deepens our knowledge of the biology of the disease event and the pandemic, that puts this disease event in the broader perspective of the evolutionary history of Yersinia pestis and further opens the door for comparative history. I think it's evident that if we're interested in the effects of Yersinia pestis in Italy in late antiquity, the most important case of comparison is going to be the other time when Yersinia pestis was present for a long term in Italy in pre-industrial conditions, namely the period of the second pandemic. But the identification of the pathogen encourages that direction. Archaeogenetics will also fill in gaps of our knowledge. Our written sources are extremely patchy and lacunose. They're full of gaps that we will never be able to fill. But in the light of increasing contributions from ancient DNA, we can fill in major gaps about when and where the plague was. And increasingly, as we saw from Gunnar's presentation, we'll start to build out the phylogenetics of the pandemic itself to see the relationship, the family tree of relationships between different strains, even within the first pandemic, which over the next 5 to 10 years promises to be extremely illuminating. And again, to make this point that this new kind of evidence works best in conversation with renewed scrutiny of the written evidence. And so today I want to look at that written evidence at a high level in one regional case study, Italy. To look at the whole first pandemic and what we know of it in Italy from the initial outbreak in the 540s for over 2 centuries down to the middle or even second half of the 8th century. And to try and ask questions about how we might understand the persistence of plague. What is it about plague that determines its persistence, its recurrence, and what kind of questions can we ask? And I think it's increasingly important to take regional views. And in this case, I'm looking at a region that has been really strangely neglected. There's never been a close study of the entirety of the written evidence from late antique Italy. So this is in some ways a first accounting comprehensively of the evidence for late antique Italy. And I think it's part of an ongoing project that we've seen exemplified today that combines traditional approaches with comparative history, with archaeogenetics, and with traditional forms of archaeology. So I'll talk about some of my recent work, but also at the end come around to what I think are some of the interesting questions that we'll be able to ask. And a lot of this comes from a publication that will finally, after only 3 or 4 years of peer review and waiting, appear supposedly in April. I've seen page proofs that looks at the written evidence in Italy in greater detail. We are all enduringly indebted to the seminal work of Biraben and Le Goff on the first pandemic in the 60s. And here you see a really striking and influential visual representation of the shape of the first pandemic, and their argument that the pandemic should be imagined as a series of waves. And if you know the terminology splitters and lumpers, people who look at a document like this and either see all of its diversity and uncertainty, or people who see neatly coherent waves, they put it in terms of waves. And they drew lines where they think that the waves of plague were. So we're enduringly indebted to this, but I think we are working in a moment, particularly with the rise of increasing amounts of DNA evidence, where we need at least to step back from the assumption that this is an accurate description of the way the pandemic works as a whole, to question what we really know about the patterns of the plague's persistence and recurrence over this period. And ultimately, the persistence of plague is rooted in the biology and the ecology of the pathogen itself. The plague bacterium is fundamentally a zoonotic disease. So it's not like COVID-19 that had zoonotic origins, but then underwent evolutionary changes that adapted it to human populations, to the human body as a host, and will probably, unfortunately, circulate permanently in human populations. COVID-19, the SARS-CoV-2 virus, can still move back and forth between humans and animals, and does all the time, but it doesn't need animals other than humans, the human animal. It is permanently established in human populations. It is adapted in genetic terms to circulate permanently. Plague is different. It can absolutely circulate in human populations for a time, but not sustainably. It's not adapted to human populations. We're irrelevant to its evolutionary sustainability and trajectory. It fundamentally remains a zoonotic disease that is very versatile and capable of infecting virtually any mammal and certainly infecting humans. But it doesn't last permanently in human populations. And secondly, it's a vector-borne disease. So it's moving certainly between animal populations via flea vectors, and probably significantly between animal populations and human populations via vectors. And both of these features are contributing factors to the sheer intensity of bubonic plague as a disease. It's a zoonotic disease. It has no incentive to care about what happens to the human host. We are completely accidental to its evolutionary trajectory, and it's a vector-borne disease. Many vector-borne diseases are particularly virulent, perhaps because it can get from one host to the next, even if you lay immobilized and die. So plague, because of its biology, is an ecologically complex disease, and this is really fundamental to understanding why plague sticks around once it gets into a certain region. It's moving more or less permanently in a range of wild animal hosts, but occasionally, for reasons that are only partly understood, gets into other animal populations that are closer to humans, and domestic or particularly commensal animals like the black rat, and from there infects humans. Of course, as we heard a little bit today, one of the enduring questions is exactly how human outbreaks work, because plague can transmit directly between humans, even via the respiratory route. And it's very possible that human outbreaks of plague are composite events with the plague bacterium transmitting in multiple pathways between humans, between animals, and humans. So it's an extraordinarily complex disease. We have to remember rises into human populations for a time and then retreats into wild animal populations somewhere. This is one of the hard questions. It's a horrific disease that causes distinct clinical courses, most notably bubonic plague, that happens when a flea bites a human. The bacteria enter the lymph system, migrate to the nearest lymph node, cause extreme painful swelling, fever, ultimately septicemia and death. Sometimes it overruns the immune system before bubonic symptoms have been able to occur and causes blood poisoning and death. Sometimes it enters the lung, either secondarily or through respiratory transmission, and causes a rapid and very usually fatal course of disease known as pneumonic plague. So it's a very complex disease, even inside the human body. The DNA evidence has helped to put the story of the first pandemic into a broader evolutionary history, as we also heard today. And one of the revelations is that Central Asia is the ancestral homeland, the evolutionary backdrop for the longer history of Yersinia pestis. And one of the hard questions is how and when did it get from here to here? from the Issyk-Kul region of Central Asia to what John of Ephesus calls the central part of the country of India. How does it get to the Red Sea world from Central Asia? Does it also have a northern trajectory? Does it move quickly over a matter of years or decades, or had it migrated somewhere into the Indian Ocean world decades or centuries before? These are hard questions that we can hope for illumination. What we do know is that when plague shows up in the Mediterranean world in 541, it makes an extraordinary mark in the written record. Observers realized that this was something that they had not experienced, that it was something that was exceptionally deadly in a world that was seething with different infectious diseases, where oscillations in mortality were normal. This absolutely stood out to every observer who wrote about it at the time. So there are important questions about the geography of the disease, both how it got started in the Mediterranean, and then how did it keep going? For over 2 centuries, there are recurrent outbreaks every decade or so. It depends on exactly where you are. Do we imagine that the plague is continually reintroduced into this world, this interconnected world from without? Or does it focalize? Does it infect animals, presumably, but not certainly, wild animals, somewhere in the greater Mediterranean world, and from there flare up to infect human populations again? And those don't have to be completely mutually exclusive answers either. Some of both is certainly possible. Again, we can look to the second pandemic for perspectives, and particular to the second pandemic in Italy with all of its rich documentation. We know that the plague is an extremely variable disease over the course of this pandemic. It varied over time, and it varied over space, even in single outbreaks, like a very well-documented outbreak known as the Plague of San Carlo in the 1570s. The death rate in different cities of Italy varies by over an order of magnitude. So you have tremendous variation, even in a single outbreak that's not particularly well understood. That's the outcome of a complex system of human factors, of physical factors in the climate, as well as biological factors to do with the host pathogen and vectors. So it's a tremendously tricky disease to study, but at the same time, I don't want to overemphasize the trickiness of it to lose the bigger point that the introduction and persistence of Yersinia pestis into a human population is simply a fundamental demographic fact. Here's the population estimates of Italy over the last, over 750 years. These are round figures, but considered good estimates by historical demographers. You can see that the Black Death dramatically reduces the population of Italy, but just as importantly, is not just the single effect of the Black Death, but is the persistence of the Italian population at relatively low levels, because very widespread and intense plague outbreaks occurred multiple times throughout the 14th and very early 15th century. Then there's a long period where the plague is still around, but it tends to be more urban. It tends to be more socially discriminatory, so particularly affects the poor. And even during a period of really intense warfare in Italy, the population grows because plague is less intense. And then the second pandemic closes with a series of extremely important outbreaks, first in northern Italy in 1629, 30, 31, and then in much of central and southern Italy in 1650s. And after that, the plague relents and population grows again. So the population history of Italy changes. I think it would be surprising if in antiquity, late antiquity and early Middle Ages, the population of Italy was completely static. I think the question is when and how much does the population change and why? In the case of second millennium pre-industrial Italy, the intensity of bubonic plague is the #1 factor on the direction of the overall population. The Black Death is not a one-off that simply happens and then goes away. Instead, it's the pattern of recurrence that prevents populations that are often quite good at recovering from epidemic mortality, from really regaining their previous levels. And a point that is, I think, particularly relevant for historians of late antique Italy, that a period when Italy is again the site of the major European conflicts, this time with gunpowder weaponry, sees the population just grow and grow and grow. And this is a point that I like to make rhetorically, because late antique Italian historians always just say that the Byzantine Gothic wars were terrible, and the reason why the settlement declines and deurbanization happens is because of these grinding series of wars. I do not understand why people running around poking each other are killing so many people when in the early modern period where they're firing projectile gunpowder weapons, this doesn't happen. So I think we need to be more critical of the story of how wars impact population. In fact, usually the demographic impact of war is really how it affects the epidemiology of a population. So what drives these big cyclical changes in the intensity of bubonic plague and the second pandemic in Italy? We don't really totally know, but we know that plague is an exceptionally ecologically complex disease, and that changes in climate, changes in human social factors, biological as well as social and political factors, are all connected and are the matrix within which these major changes in the disease environment and consequently the demographic history of Italy are taking place. So I think that knowledge of the experience of Italy in this period can inform the way we look at the late antique Italian sources. This is a period of transformation in Italy, of fragmentation, of urban decline, of depopulation, of fundamental changes in settlement patterns. Nonetheless, plague in Italy has been handled in wildly different ways, which is kind of an understatement, ranging from people who think it's extremely important to people who write about the history of 6th century Italy, virtually without mentioning the existence of plague. So the only way to redress this is to start by looking at all of the written evidence and then use that in a comparative framework, along with insights that do not yet exist for Italy from archaeogenetics, as well as conventional archaeology. As I said, the conventional view is that there are dramatic changes in the settlement system and the social and economic system of Italy in the 6th century, but that these are best explained by changes, by conflict, and by changes in rulership. Here you see the Tiber Valley survey, which is just one particularly richly documented example of major settlement change and decline in the middle of the 6th century in Italy. So this is from my own work that's forthcoming, that is really a first catalog of written evidence from Italy and tries to piece together what we know, and I think just as importantly, what we don't know. And in some ways, the sad conclusion that I made after this comprehensive study is simply how much we don't know about the history of the first pandemic in a place, even that's as important, the crossroads of the Mediterranean, the capital of the old Roman Empire in Italy. Here's a graphic representation of when I think that there are likely or certain plague outbreaks in Italy. I'll come back to this, but for now, the point I want to make with it is that this does anything except scream that there are clearly a series of well-defined waves of plague. I think it's very difficult right now to construct the history of the first pandemic into any very neat pattern. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but the written evidence on its own isn't enough to help us really understand the big picture patterns. And like I said, I'll come back to this. The written evidence for Italy is extremely exiguous. There are massive gaps in our knowledge chronologically, but what we do have, small though it is extremely compelling. And to start with the example of the 540s, the plague of Justinian, we have only two very small written notices. One is the continuator of the Chronicle of Marcellinus Comes, who's well informed about Italy, but gives one sentence. It says there was a maxima pestilentia in Italy in 543. That's our best source for the history of the Justinian plague. The problem is there is nowhere you would expect a description that it doesn't exist. Procopius is our main source for this period in Italy, and he packs all of his description of the plague into one set piece. So it's not that there's a lot of evidence where the plague is missing. The Liber Pontificalis makes a very quick oblique reference to it. And of course, if you know Bellianus' book on Ravenna, she makes a very persuasive case that in fact here we have visual evidence for someone's very apocalyptic perception, namely Julius the banker in Ravenna, who very hastily built this very nice church with these mosaics that show Christ surrounded by Michael and Gabriel, healing saints Cosmas and Damian, and then atop Christ flanked by angels blaring the horns of the trumpet. And this says in thanksgiving for what they've done for him. So he survived the plague, and probably in the midst of plague, as so many did, had prayed that if the God or the angels or the saints would just bring him through, that he would ever thereafter be a good boy and give all of his money to the church. And he lived up to the promise. So that's the interpretation. But this is it. That's all we know about the plague of Justinian from written evidence in Italy. So it's compelling, but it's extremely patchy. And it turns out that this record, which is so discontinuous and uneven, is very uncomfortably dependent on what one 8th century chronicle knows. Paul the Deacon is unsurprisingly our most important source for the plague in late antique Italy, because he's our most important written source for everything in the history of Italy from the late 6th century down to the early 8th century. So we're dependent on Paul the Deacon, and our knowledge of plague is very inordinately shaped by what he happened to know. And there are clearly phases of Italian history where he has pretty rich source records, and then there are other phases where he has very little rich documentation of what's actually going on. Paul himself lived in the 8th century. He was a noble, educated Lombard who lived through the conquest of Italy by the Carolingians. He wrote a history of the Lombards. And the study of Paul's sources, here I give you two very recent good studies, have been well studied. But I think it's a lot like Manzoni, writing 2 centuries later. The quality of his account is highly dependent on what he knew. Nonetheless, sometimes this is an extremely valuable record, and it uniformly emphasizes the extreme importance of bubonic plague. So I'll look closer at one of the most important examples. And I think this fits into a range of work that's going on right now to try and really look critically at some of the most important sources. And this particular attestation of an outbreak in Paul the Deacon's history is one of the 3 or 4 longest descriptions of a plague from the first pandemic. So John of Ephesus is in a league of his own. Procopius is second. This is probably the 3rd or 4th, I should say, non-Arabic source for the history of the pandemic, certainly in Greek or Latin. This is one of the most interesting, lengthy accounts of an outbreak of bubonic plague, and it too has virtually never been studied as a source for the plague. We know where Paul got his information about this outbreak of plague. It's where he gets most of his information in book 2 and 3 of his history that concerns northern Italy as 2 major sources. And this particular passage comes from a lost history from a bishop of northern Italy, from Secundus of Trent. We know that he was alive. He took monastic orders sometime in the 560s and lived into the 7th century. He was very closely connected with the Lombard court. He wrote a history with a very local focus. And here you see plotted a map of every place name that's mentioned in the text of Paul the Deacon that come from Secundus of Trent in book 3. You can see Secundus of Trent's world is northern Italy. He sort of knows when something happens in Constantinople, but his world is a very, very local world. And Paul the Deacon is not just using it, but as he usually does with his sources, is probably preserving it, not exactly verbatim, but very, very close. So we have very good knowledge of how Paul uses his sources because we have Gregory of Tours, we have Gregory the Great, and we can see the passages that Paul the Deacon incorporates from these extant sources. And what he preserves is very nearly the wording, style, and perspective. If a student tried this, you would probably say they were plagiarizing. It's nearly word for word. I won't go through this whole account in detail, but I want to highlight a few of the points, starting with the fact that Paul the Deacon says that in the times of this man, speaking of Narses, who was a eunuch general appointed by Justinian, who was a major player in Italy for decades, a very great pestilence broke out, particularly in the province of Liguria. Now, in nearly every history of the first pandemic, this has been dated to 571 because Legoff and Biraben want all the plague dates to align. They want there to be waves. It simply doesn't date to 571 because it's said to happen before the Lombards come into Italy. It's said to happen in the same year that Justinian dies, and it happens in the time of Narses. It's also interesting and worth reminding ourselves that when I hear Liguria, I think of the beautiful coastal region of Liguria today. Liguria in this time period means the entire western half of northern Italy. So this isn't a tiny little event geographically. And of course, this is the only part of the world that Paul the Deacon's source, Secundus of Trent, really knows. So there was a great pestilence in the 560s. This is about a generation after the plague of Justinian. We can't be entirely certain that it was the second outbreak, although I would suspect that it was the first outbreak after the plague of Justinian, but we don't know that. There were some signs that the plague was coming, and then after the lapse of a year, there began to appear in the groins of men and other rather delicate places a swelling of the glands, after the manner of a nut or a date, presently followed by an unbearable fever, so that upon the third day the man died. But if anyone should pass over the third day, he had a hope of living. So it's very clearly an observation of the clinical course of bubonic plague. Everywhere there was grief, and everywhere tears. For as common report had it that those who fled would avoid the plague, the dwellings were left deserted by their inhabitants, and the dogs only kept house. The flocks remained alone in the pastures with no shepherd at hand. You might see villages or fortified places lately filled with crowds of men, and on the next day all had departed and everything was in utter silence. So this silence that struck John of Ephesus, that's noted by Corippus, that's there in Manzoni, it's interesting that they all make that observation. Of course, this is highly rhetorical. It's Virgilian, ubique luctus, ubique lacrimae, because that's how he knew best to emphasize how traumatic this event was. He describes flight as well as mass death, and he describes an event that hits in both rural and urban places. Sons fled, leaving the corpses of their parents unburied. Parents forgetful of their duty abandoned their children in raging fever. If by chance long-standing affection constrained anyone to bury his near relative, he remained himself unburied. And while he was performing the funeral rites, he perished. While he offered obsequies to the dead, his own corpse remained without obsequies. The crops, outliving the time of harvest, awaited the reaper untouched. The vineyard with its fallen leaves and its shining grapes remained undisturbed while winter came on. So here is an Episcopal writer, but one writing in a very good traditional Roman way about plagues. It's pietas. It's the violation of the social duties that hold the social order together that so strikes Secundus of Trent writing about this plague. A trumpet, as of warriors, resounded through the hours of the night and day. Something like the murmur of an army was heard by many. There were no footsteps of passers-by, no murderer was seen. Yet the corpses of the dead were more than the eyes could discern. Pastoral places have been turned into a sepulchre for men, and human habitations have become places of refuge for wild beasts. And then, just a few chapters later, he says, nor did the Romans any longer have the strength, the virtus, to be able to resist because of the pestilence which had struck in the time of Narses and annihilated so many in Liguria and Venetia. This is a very important observation by a very well-informed contemporary local observer who does draw important consequential connections between a mortality event, a bubonic plague outbreak that struck his world in northern Italy, and significant movements of people, changes of rulerships, in this case, the Lombard takeover of northern Italy in the late 560s. Doesn't mean we have to believe it, but it's certainly the case that this text wants to tell you that what happens in this part of the world is a devastating outbreak of bubonic plague, not the plague of Justinian, but a later outbreak, that had such important demographic consequences that it had downstream geopolitical implications. So it's important that we continue to deepen our familiarity with these human testimonies, to think about the language and rhetoric that they use to tell us about their perceptions. This is from a contemporary eyewitness. The geographic description really has nothing to do with the extent of the plague as much as it does to do with Secundus's world. There's a passage not so far noticed in Gregory the Great's dialogues, where he also describes an outbreak of severe disease in the time of Narses in Rome. That could be the same event, but doesn't have to be. And of course, links mortality with political consequences. So this is this outbreak, 565 in Italy. Here you see the outbreaks in Italy, along with a number of other regions. And there are repeated severe pervasive outbreaks of bubonic plague in Italy throughout the 6th century. In the 560s, again in 589, 590, as we've talked about today, again in 600, and just possibly in 603. There's then a gap in the record in Italy of nearly 8 decades. So we cannot be certain that we know of every outbreak in the first 2 generations. It would not be surprising if there's coverage that we simply don't have. I would say we have no idea if the plague goes away from Italy, or if we just don't know. there aren't a huge number of sources where we would expect the plague to be described. The Liber Pontificalis only occasionally mentions plague when it intersects its own particular interest. Paul the Deacon's sources for this part of the 7th century are very, very thin because Gregory of Tours has gone away, Gregory the Great has died, and his other sources from northern Italy, like Secundus of Trent, have died. Paul the Deacon doesn't know what's happening, and we don't know what's happening. This is one area where archaeogenetics may be extremely important in eventually confirming or possibly disproving the reality of this gap in the written record. And then, I won't spend much time on it now, but there's something interesting about the last 8th century phases of the plague, is that they're only attested in Naples, Sicily, and Calabria. There's no evidence in the written record for plague outbreaks in Rome or anywhere north of Rome in the 8th century. Again, we don't know if that's a real pattern or simply an artifact of the sources that we simply have. But it's, I think, now at a place where we put the totality of the written evidence together, and then we use the archaeogenetic evidence to try and figure out whether this pattern is real or not. But I think this is a problem that will eventually be solved. Go back to what do we think are the drivers of patterns in plague in Italy, and to reemphasize that there's no single factor, particularly with a disease as complex as plague. And we need to imagine constant volatility in the physical climate that affects agriculture, that affects human population, that has its own independent dynamics, that affects the disease pool, that affects agriculture. There should be a line there from agriculture to rodents. And so it's a complex system with numerous moving parts that are accounting for the patterns of plague in the second pandemic and are very likely the main drivers in the first pandemic. So what I'm saying now is not in the published paper that's coming out, but is really more looking forward and asking questions. So do changes in agricultural output, do changes in rodent populations, do changes in human networks help us understand the patterns of plague in Italy? I think they have the potential to. Here is some climate data. I would love to get Elena's data and test it against this as well. So I don't know where she is. We can talk about this. But this is the 2016 data, which is what I could find from Ulf Bünken's study of alpine tree rings. And this is an alpine summer. Oh, that's not good. What happened to my axis? Oh, that's okay. You can see the pattern is right. The axis is just in the wrong place. So the temperature, summer temperature record from the northern edge of Italy, so not necessarily temperature for all of Italy, although probably has strong correlations with the northern part of Italy. And you see the association between plague outbreaks in my record that are likely or certain, and just at a first blush, it suggests that it's well worth exploring what might the relationship be between changes in the climate and changes in outbreaks of epidemic disease. I will be honest, I don't like how close this association is. It's really, really striking that there seems to be a relationship between moments of extreme cooling and outbreaks of plague. And we don't know what the mechanism would be that would link those two. Could it be harvest failure that causes hunger, that causes biological vulnerability in human populations, or causes migration in human populations? Could it be that the climate is affecting commensal rodents? Could it be that the climate is affecting wild rodents? We're only at the beginning of being able to ask these questions. But I think with increasingly rich paleoclimate data and richer climate models in combination with archaeogenetics and a richer picture of the periodicity of plague outbreaks, we're able to explore these questions. Climate should absolutely not be the only factor, but it seems like it's very possibly one part of a complex system that's driving outbreaks in human plagues. Here's a graph you've already seen once today. This is the UNL 2022 paper that David was a big part of, and he talked about. And what this story that is emerging seems to suggest, and we'll learn a lot more thanks to the RADIS project, is that there are major changes in the history of commensal rodents, particularly in Western and Northern Europe, where there is so far in evidence from the genetic data that have been retrieved, evidence for a major turnover of black rat populations. And I think what David's doing will help us deepen our understanding of a heretofore almost unimaginably rich history of the black rat. is the relative changes in the population levels of the black rat, part of the story of the history of the plague. So it's a question that we're going to have increasingly better answers to. What role did human networks play? Here's a very crude representation of human connectivity drawn from the Oxford shipwreck database and then plotted by the midpoint of the date range. But it does point to major changes in human networks. And there's certainly much better ways to explore this. This is one of the main themes of Mike McCormick's Origins of the European Economy. But we need to imagine changing patterns of human connectivity, changing patterns between northern Italy and southern Italy, between Italy and Western Europe, between Italy and the Mediterranean. Does seaborne trade in Italy become more compartmentalized? Does it simply decrease in frequency? Is southern Italy the region of Italy that seems to experience enduring outbreaks of plague, experiencing outbreaks of plague because it is still connected into networks of connectivity somewhere in the southern Mediterranean or the eastern Mediterranean? Maybe. What I think is most likely is that we have to imagine a complex interaction between agriculture, human well-being, climate and rodents, human settlement patterns and rodents, and human networks that are moving plague once it moves out of animal populations in different ways. What we know now is a lot more than we knew 5 or 6 years ago, but I hope is a lot less than we'll know in days to come. There are other ways to try and get at this problem. This is a map that I'm very grateful to my colleague at Brown, Tyler Branconi, for creating. We have reviewed over 500 published burial reports from late antique Italy. There are a lot of bodies out there. And one thing that's very clear is that a lot of them seem to be buried in strange or anomalous ways that violate strongly held norms of single inhumation, usually with east-west orientation and respectful layout of the corpse. There are, by our count, over 150 multiple burials from late antique Italy, surely not all of which need to be crisis conditions or certainly not the plague, but that provide some very intriguing avenues for our exploration, both in terms of simply the archaeology of this fundamental human practice that tends to be very conventional, as well as, of course, opening the potential for bioarchaeology and archaeogenetics. And so we're working with Katerina Jostra and Mike McCormick and his project with MHAM on the possibilities there. What we know today, I hope, in 5 or 6 years, seems very little to what we have the possibility to learn. Italy is important in the bigger story, not only because Italy is a crossroads that connects east and west and north and south, because its extremely richly documented history in the second pandemic opens up extraordinary possibilities for comparison in the experience of this singular human disease. Thank you very much, and I hope there are questions.